I'm Margaret Donnelly, 62 years old, and I spent 38 years in the United States Navy, the last of them as a rear admiral. For most of my life, I gave my family my loyalty, my attention, and my silence, while they decided that the work I did would never count as real. But when a guard waved me toward the door of the very hall built to honor the night I saved 19 men, and my own brother agreed that I was nobody, I made a choice I should have made decades earlier. Have you ever been dismissed by the very people who should have known you best? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being overlooked, hit that like button and subscribe. The drawer in my kitchen sticks in the summer, and every year on the same morning in June, I have to lean my whole weight into it before it gives. Inside, under the takeout menus and the spare keys that no longer open anything, there's a folded program and one photograph with a white crease running across it like a scar. I took them both out on a Tuesday afternoon, smoothed the photograph flat on the counter, and stood there with my coffee going cold the way I had stood every June for 37 years. For 37 years, I had marked that morning quietly, alone, the way you tend a grave that no one else remembers is there. I did not call anyone to tell them where I was going. I had learned a long time ago that the places that mattered most to me were the places my family found easiest to laugh at. So I kept them to myself, the way you keep anything you cannot bear to watch someone else handle carelessly. To understand why a closed drawer in a creased photograph could undo a woman who had commanded ships, you have to go back to the house I grew up in. A narrow gray house near the water where the Navy was both our religion and our weapon. My father, Raymond Donnelly, was a senior chief boatswain's mate, and when he was home, he ruled the dinner table the way he ruled a deck, with a flat voice and an eye for anything out of place. He had spent 30 years getting wet and cold for his country, and he measured every sailor who ever lived by exactly that. How wet did you get? How cold did you stand it? By that measure, there were real sailors and there was everyone else, and he never let the two be confused. I loved his sea stories more than my brother ever did. I would sit closest to him when he talked about heavy weather in the North Atlantic, about green water coming over the bow, about a chief who could splice a line in the dark. I memorized the names of ships the way other girls memorize songs. When he said the word Navy, something in my chest stood up straight. There's one memory I have carried longer than any other, and it tells you everything about the house I grew up in. I was 9 years old, and my father had taken me down to the pier where his ship was tied up. He let me put my hand on the cold steel of the hull, and he told me that a ship is alive, that she breathes and groans and keeps her people safe if her people keep her safe first. I asked him in the way children ask the enormous questions without knowing it, whether a girl could ever take care of a ship like that. He laughed. It was not a mean laugh. That was the strange thing. It was an easy, certain laugh. The laugh of a man who had simply never considered the question worth taking seriously. And that easy certainty did more damage than cruelty ever could have. Cruelty you can argue with. A man laughing because the idea of you is charming and impossible, that you cannot argue with, because there is nothing there to push against. I spent the next 40 years pushing against it anyway. My brother Lawrence was 2 years older and twice as loud, and he learned early that the fastest way to make our father laugh was to make a joke at my expense. If I asked a question about the fleet, Lawrence would answer in a high voice, pretending to be me, pretending I was a little girl playing dress-up. My father would smile into his coffee, and that smile taught both of us something. It taught Lawrence that mocking me was rewarded. It taught me that my devotion was something to be managed, kept quiet, never shown at full size. The imbalance in our family was simple, though it took me decades to say it plainly. I gave them my whole heart, and what came back was a running verdict that my heart was pointed at something that did not count. I gave attention, loyalty, and later money, and I received a nickname. That was the exchange rate in the Donnelly house, and I accepted it for far too long because it was the only currency I was offered. In 1986, after college and officer candidate school, I came home in my ensign's uniform. I had pressed it 3 times. I had practiced in the mirror of a gas station bathroom on the drive, the calm way I would stand in the doorway so that it would look like I had always belonged in that cloth. I believed, the way you believe at 22, that the uniform would finally make the verdict change, that my father would stand up. He did not stand up. He looked at me from his chair, at the gold on my shoulder boards, and he took a slow sip of his coffee. Then he told me that the wardroom was the dry end of the boat, and that officers were the people who signed for the work that men like him actually did. He said it without heat, which was worse than if he had shouted, because it meant he was not angry. He simply did not see anything in front of him worth getting up for. I stood in that doorway in my brand new uniform, and my mother Joan looked at me from the kitchen with an expression I could not read at the time. My father went back to his newspaper. Lawrence, leaning in the hall, asked if they let pretend admirals carry real guns. And that was the first small wound, the one it would take me the rest of my life to learn the name of. The wound of being invisible in the one place you most wanted to be seen. I want to tell you that I gave up on them that day, but that would be a lie. And this is not a story I am willing to lie inside of. I did not give up. I went out and became exactly the thing my father said was not real, and I became very, very good at it, and I spent the next 37 years bringing the proof home in my hands, hoping that this time the weight of it would be enough. It never was. But the proof was real, and it was about to find a home in a building my family would walk into, without ever understanding what was hanging on the wall. So let me take you to sea first, to the year everything I was made of got tested in smoke and rising water. And then let me take you to the hall, 37 years later, where a tired young man in a security vest waved me toward the door and told me it was time to leave. I went, of course. I always went. That was the whole problem, and that June afternoon was the day it finally stopped. But I am getting ahead of myself. First, you need to know who I was at 25 and what I did when the deck went hot beneath my feet. Because everything that happened in that hall, everything the director did when he looked from the wall to my face, only makes sense if you know what that photograph with the white crease was actually a picture of. It was a picture of the worst and best night of my life, and of 19 men who are alive today, because I did not walk out of that room either. In 1988, I was 24 years old, a brand new lieutenant junior grade, and I reported aboard the destroyer USS Garrick as a junior surface warfare officer and assistant damage control officer. I wrote home the week I reported aboard. I described the ship, the smell of the engineering spaces, the chief who showed me the repair lockers. I sealed the letter with the particular hope of a young person who still believes a good enough description will change someone's mind. The letter went unanswered for weeks. When my father finally called, he did not ask about the ship. He asked whether I had made it onto a real deck yet, or whether they still had me counting life jackets. I told him I was the assistant damage control officer. There was a pause on the line, and then he said that sounded like a clipboard job, and asked to speak to my brother about a truck he was selling. That was how the family reframed my work, not as seamanship, as paperwork, as the dry end of the boat, again and again, no matter what deck I actually stood on. Lawrence, by then selling boats at a marina and very pleased with himself, coined the nickname that would outlast everything: the Pretend Admiral. He used it first at a cousin's wedding, raising his glass to me across the table. And the table laughed, and my father laughed, and I smiled the way you smile when the alternative is to cry in front of people who would enjoy it. There was one current running the other way, and it ran quietly. My mother called me on a Sunday when my father was out, and she told me she had cut the small notice out of the base newspaper, the one that listed me reporting aboard Garrick. She had it in a shoebox, she said. She asked me in a careful voice not to mention it to my father. My mother loved me in a whisper, because in our house, love for me had to be kept somewhere my father would not find it. I taped that clipping inside my rack aboard the ship. At night, under the red lamp that engineers use so their eyes stay ready for the dark, I would read it, this little gray rectangle that said my name and the name of my ship in the same sentence. And I would fold it small again and put it in my pocket like contraband. That was what a kind word from my family felt like in those years. Something smuggled. Something you hid so it would not be taken away. Aboard Garrick, I did the thing my family said was not real. And I did it like my life depended on it, because at sea, it does. I drilled the damage control teams until they hated me, and then until they were proud. I learned every valve, every void, every watertight door on that ship by feel, in the dark, with my eyes closed, because that is how you have to know them when the lights are gone and the water is coming. My leading chief told me one night, leaning on a bulkhead with a cup of coffee, that he had never seen an officer that junior run a repair locker that tight. He said it like a small, grudging gift, and I held on to it. I was good at exactly the thing my father called a clipboard job. I was good at keeping a ship alive. And the strange, cruel mathematics of my family was that the better I got at it, the more invisible it made me at home. Because the better I got, the further I drifted from the wet and cold deck my father had decided was the only thing worth respecting. I did not know, in those years, that the proof I kept bringing home would one day stop needing them to validate it. I did not know that a building existed, or would exist, that would simply agree with the facts of my life, without requiring my father to get up from his chair. I only knew the sea, and the ship, and the drills, and the small folded clipping in my pocket. And then, on a night in June of 1989, the proof stopped being a matter of paperwork. The proof became fire, and smoke, and a compartment filling with water, and a choice about whether to go down into it. We were on a workup in the North Atlantic, the kind of demanding training period that wrings a ship out before deployment. The weather was heavy, the watch was tired, and somewhere below the waterline, in the after-engine room, a fuel line was about to fail in the worst possible way, and the ship was about to find out exactly what its junior damage control officer was made of. I have spent 37 years trying to describe what happened next in a way that does it justice, and I have mostly failed because the truth is too large for the words. But I will try, because 19 men deserve the attempt, and because you need to see it to understand the wall. The general alarm woke me out of a dead sleep, and I was on my feet and moving before my mind had fully caught up to my body, which is the entire point of all those drills my teams had hated me for. The word came over the announcing system in a voice that was working hard to stay level. Fire, after engine room. Fire, after engine room. The two words every sailor learns to fear, because below the waterline, far from the open air, fire and the sea are the same enemy wearing two faces. I will not give you a graphic account, because the men who lived it do not need it dramatized, and the men who did not come home that night deserve better than spectacle. But I will tell you the shape of it. A fuel line had failed and sprayed onto a hot surface, and the after-engine room had become a place no person could breathe. The fire main was fighting it, but the water that fights a fire below decks does not disappear. It rises, and there were sailors trapped on the wrong side of it, in a compartment that was filling, with the heat above them and the cold sea coming up beneath. As the assistant damage control officer, my place was at the scene, leading the repair party. I remember the heat through the soles of my boots before I ever saw a flame. I remember the smoke so thick that my carefully memorized ship, the ship I knew by feel in the dark, was the only map I had, because my eyes were useless. I remember reaching out and finding the watertight door exactly where my hands knew it would be, and being grateful for 1/2 of a second for every drill that had made my teams resent me. We got the fire boundaries set. We cooled the bulkheads, and then I learned that there were men still down in the afterspace, on the far side of the flooding, where the smoke was thickest and the water was already at the waist. The book, the cold and sensible book, says you seal a flooding compartment to save the ship. The book is right, and the book is why the rest of the crew was safe. But there is a moment before you throw that final seal when the question is no longer about the ship. It is about whether you can reach the men first. I went down into it. I took 2 volunteers from my repair party, and we went into the smoke and the rising water with breathing apparatus and a guideline, and we found them, 4 sailors clinging to the high side of a space that was trying to become their grave. We got 3 of them moving. The 4th was a young petty officer who had been knocked half senseless, a sailor named Otis Brennan, and he could not climb on his own. I have been asked many times over the years what I was thinking in that moment. The honest answer is that I was not thinking anything that would sound noble written down. I was thinking about the geometry of the ladder and the weight of a grown man and how many seconds the air in my apparatus had left and whether the angle would let me carry him. I was doing the arithmetic of a clipboard job, the dry job, the job my father said was not real, except the clipboard was a man's life and the numbers were measured in breaths. I got my shoulder under him. The 2 sailors with me took his weight from above, and we carried Otis Brennan up out of the water and through the smoke and over the combing of that watertight door, and we cleared the space, and the compartment was sealed behind us, and the ship lived. 19 men who had been below the waterline that night walked off USS Garrick when she made port. 19. When it was over, I sat on the deck in the passageway with soot in my teeth and my hands shaking, and I did not feel like a hero. I felt like a person who had done the math and gotten lucky. A photographer from the squadron came aboard the next morning to document the damage, and somewhere in that morning, he took a picture of me helping a sailor onto a stretcher, stood on my face, my eyes 1,000 yards away. I did not even know the photograph existed for years. The days after were their own strange country. The ship limped into port for repairs, and the crew moved through the passageways quieter than I had ever heard them. The particular quiet of people who have all silently agreed how close it had been. The sailors I had pulled out came to find me, one by one, in that awkward way young men have when they do not have the words for the size of the thing. One of them, a kid from somewhere landlocked who had never seen the ocean before he joined, just shook my hand and could not let go of it, and finally said that his mother had told him to find the officer and say thank you, and that he had been trying to work up to it for 3 days. I told him his mother raised him right and to go call her. I did not tell him that my own father had not called me. I did not tell anyone that. You learn early, in a family like mine, to keep the wound where it will not show in the uniform. What stayed with me most was not the fire. It was the realization, sitting in that quiet ship, that I had done the truest work of my life, and the one person whose verdict I had spent my whole childhood chasing would find a way to call it filing. I knew it before I even sent the citation home. I sent it anyway. Hope is a stubborn engine, and mine kept running long after the fuel should have been gone. Months later, they put me in a dress uniform and read a citation aloud and pinned the Navy and Marine Corps medal to my chest, the decoration given for non-combat heroism at the risk of one's own life. I sent my parents a copy of the citation. My father said it was good that the Navy had to give out awards for the office staff too, so they would not feel left out. Lawrence asked if there was a medal for filing. I stopped sending proof home after that, not out of anger, out of self-preservation. I took the medal and the citation, and eventually the creased photograph, and I kept them in a drawer that sticks in summer, and I built the rest of my life somewhere they could not reach to make small. What I did not know was that the squadron photographer's picture and the bell of USS Garrick and a copy of my citation would one day hang together on a wall in a quiet hall by the water, waiting for me. The Naval Heritage Hall sits in a low brick building near the water, the kind of place school buses pull up to on weekday mornings, and almost no one visits on a Tuesday afternoon in June. I had been going there for years, ever since a curator tracked me down to ask permission to display the Garrick materials. I never went on busy days. I went on quiet afternoons, alone, so that I could stand in front of that wall without performing anything for anyone. This year, my brother invited himself along. Lawrence had heard me mention at a rare family lunch that I visited a hall that had something about my old ship. He decided, with the particular delight he had carried since we were children, that he wanted to see the famous wall for himself. I knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted to stand in front of whatever it was and find it smaller than I had made it sound so he could carry that home too. I let him come anyway. I am still not entirely sure why. Maybe some part of me, 62 years old, was still 22 in a doorway, still hoping the proof would finally be enough. He kept up a low patter from the parking lot onward. He said I always needed a building to feel important. He said some people had hobbies and some people had whole museums for theirs. He read the banner over the door in a sarcastic voice. I walked through it all the way I had learned to walk through weather, head down, course steady. The hall inside is high-ceilinged and dim and reverent, full of glass cases and ship's bells and the particular hush of a place built to remember. We walked the length of it, Lawrence narrating, until we reached the far end where the memorial wall stands. And there it was. The bell of USS Garrick, polished, mounted, a framed citation under glass, and a large photograph of a 25-year-old officer with soot on her face, helping a sailor onto a stretcher, her eyes 1,000 yards away. I stopped in front of it the way I always did, and something in my chest stood up straight. The way it had when I was a girl, and my father said the word Navy. Lawrence stopped beside me. He did not connect the soot-streaked young face to his sister. Why would he? He had spent 37 years deciding in advance that there was nothing of mine worth looking at closely. He read the placard out loud in a bored voice, stumbled over the word Garrick, said something about how they would put anyone on a wall these days, and started to drift toward the next case. That was when the young man in the security vest came sweeping toward us. He was perhaps 24, a contract guard, tired at the end of a long, quiet shift, and he was doing the ordinary job of clearing the floor before closing. He did not look up at our faces. He waved a hand at us the way you wave at a fly, "We're closing, ma'am. Let's go. Main doors are that way." His voice was not cruel. It was simply the voice of a young man who had decided, without looking, that the woman lingering at the wall was just an old lady in the way of his lockup. And my brother who had ridden this exact horse since we were children, climbed right on. He put a hand on my shoulder, light and dismissive, and he said the thing he had been waiting his whole life to find the perfect room for. "Come on, Meg. No one cares about your little Navy hobby. Let the kid lock up." I did not argue. Of course I did not argue. I had been walking out of rooms to make other people comfortable for 62 years. I turned to go, but I stopped just for a second for one last look at the photograph. And across the hall, a man doing his closing walk with a clipboard in his hand, the director, glanced up at the sound of the guard's voice. He looked at the photograph on the wall, then he looked at my face, and he went very, very still. For a long moment, nothing in the hall moved. The guard had already half turned away, expecting us to file out like everyone else. Lawrence had his hand on my shoulder, steering, and the director stood 20 feet off with his clipboard, lowering slowly to his side, looking from the soot-streaked young officer in the photograph to the gray-haired woman being waved toward his doors, and you could see the arithmetic happening behind his eyes. I felt it before I understood it, the way you feel a change in the sea before you see it. But I was already moving toward the exit, because that is what my body had been trained by a lifetime to do. Make yourself small. Spare everyone the trouble of you. I had commanded ships, I had been saluted by hundreds, and I still could not make myself stay in a room when one tired young man told me it was time to leave. The director said one word. He said my name, the old way, the way a quarterdeck says it. "Admiral Donnelly." I froze. I did not turn around, not yet. Because if I turned around and I was wrong, if it was a coincidence, if he was calling someone else, then I would have to carry that too. And I was not sure I had room left to carry one more disappointment in front of my brother. So I stood with my hand reaching for the cold brass rail by the exit, and I let his voice hang there in the air behind me. And I did the thing I have done my whole life. I hesitated at the door. I want to step out of that frozen moment for a minute, because to understand why a single word could nail me to the floor of a museum, you have to understand the conversation I had 3 days earlier, on the phone, with the one person alive who knew what these June visits cost me. Her name is Frances Cole, though everyone who loves her calls her Fran, and we have been friends since we were lieutenants together. 2 young women in a Navy that was still deciding whether it wanted us. Fran retired a captain. She is 60 now, blunt as a marlin spike, and she is the only person on this earth I have ever told the whole truth to about my family. She called me that Saturday because she always calls me the week of the anniversary. She asked if I was going to the wall again. I told her I was, and that Lawrence had decided to come. There was a silence on the line that I could have hung a coat on. "You saved 19 men, Meg," she said finally. "You don't owe your brother a ride to the place that proves it." I told her he was family. She said something I have thought about every day since. She said, "Family is supposed to be the people who already know what you're worth. You keep driving back to a house to apply for a job you've already had for 40 years. I did not have an answer for her then, but sitting with it afterward, I laid out the arithmetic of my whole life, the way I used to lay out the arithmetic of a flooding compartment. Every promotion weighed by my family against a single, unmovable verdict and found wanting. Every command, every ribbon, every hard-won qualification sat on the scale opposite my father's creed, and the scale never moved. I had spent decades adding weight to my side, and the beam had never so much as trembled. I thought about the day I took command of my first ship, a destroyer, the thing my father had told me officers only signed for and never truly ran. I had called home that evening, still in my dress whites, the deck of my own ship under my feet for the first time. My father had asked whether the enlisted men were giving me trouble, as though the only real question about a woman in command was how badly the real sailors resented her. I had stood on the bridge wing of a ship I commanded and felt, for a moment, exactly 9 years old again, with my hand on a cold hull, asking permission to belong. That is the thing no rank ever fixed. You can be saluted by 1,000 people and still carry a single chair in your chest that one person refuses to rise from, and somehow that empty chair outweighs the 1,000. I had built a career strong enough to hold up other people's lives, and I had never once been able to make it hold up my own sense of being enough. Fran was right. I kept driving back to apply for a job I had held with honor for 40 years, and every June I filled out the application again, and every June the position stayed posted. And I admitted to myself finally why I kept coming to that hall alone every June. It was not to be seen by my family. I had given up on that without ever saying the words. I came because the hall was the only place in my life that simply agreed with the facts. It did not require my father to stand up. It did not require Lawrence to stop joking. It hung the photograph, and it polished the bell, and it kept the citation under glass, and it said, without my having to argue for it, this happened, and it mattered, and she was the one who did it. That is why the director's voice nailed me to the floor. Because for the first time, the place that agreed with the facts had spoken them out loud, in a room, with my brother standing right there. The wall had found its voice, and it was calling me by my name, and I was too frightened of being wrong to turn around and answer it. So I stood there, 62 years old, a retired admiral with a hand on a brass rail, caught between the door my whole life had trained me to walk through, and a voice behind me saying the truest thing anyone in my family had ever stood close enough to hear. And then I made a decision, the last decision of the old life and the first decision of the new one. I decided to turn around. For 37 years, I had walked out of rooms to make other people comfortable. I decided, with my hand on that cold brass rail, that this would be the last one I let anyone push me out of. It was not a dramatic thought. There was no swell of music in my head. It was quieter than that, and harder. It was the simple decision to stop applying for a job I had already held with honor for 40 years. I let go of the rail. I turned around. The director was closer now, close enough that I could see his name tag and the Old Navy in the way he held himself. Captain, retired I would learn, a man named Elias Warwick who had given the second half of his life to keeping this hall. He looked from the photograph to my face one more time, and whatever doubt had been in him resolved into something like reverence, and his voice when it came was unsteady. "It's you," he said. "Admiral Donnelly, you're the officer on the wall." He gestured at the photograph, at the soot-streaked young woman on the stretcher detail, as though introducing me to myself. "We have told your story to 10,000 schoolchildren. I know that citation by heart. I never thought I would get to say it to your face." The young guard, Trent, had stopped where he stood. I watched the color drain out of him as he understood. The old lady he had waved toward the door like a fly was the woman the whole far wall of his building was built around. He started to stammer something, an apology tumbling over itself, his hands half raised. I have thought a great deal, over the years, about what kind of person I want to be in the moment I am finally proven right. And I knew, watching that young man go pale, that the answer was not to make him smaller. He had done his job. He had been clearing a floor at the end of a long shift, and he had no way of knowing. So I crossed to him, and I put my hand out, and I shook his hand, and I told him exactly that. "You were doing your job, son," I said. "You had no way of knowing. There's no harm done." The relief on his face was its own small reward, and it cost me nothing, and that is the whole secret my father never learned. You do not have to take anything from anyone to stand fully in what is yours. And then I looked at my brother. Lawrence was staring at the photograph. He had walked past that young soot-streaked face in his own mind for 37 years and decided in advance it was nothing. And now he was reading it for the first time, and I watched him see it. I watched him see the line of the jaw he had grown up next to. I watched him see his sister, at 25, carrying a man out of the water while he had been at a marina selling boats and inventing a nickname. "That's," he said, and his voice did something I had never heard it do. It failed him. "That's not. That's you?" "That's me, Lawrence," I said. I was not cruel about it. I did not need to be. The truth was doing all the work that cruelty would only have gotten in the way of. That was the worst night of my life. 19 men came home because of it. And you've spent 37 years calling it my little hobby. He had no joke. For the first time in our entire lives together, my brother stood in a room with me and reached for the reliable old weapon and found his hand closing on empty air. The nickname died in his mouth. He looked at the photograph, and he looked at me, and the whole architecture of the family story, the story in which I was the pretend admiral, and he was the one who saw through me, came apart in front of him in the dim light of that hall. The director, Warwick, was watching all of this with the quick eyes of a man who had spent a career reading a room, and he made a decision of his own. He turned and he walked past me, past my brother, past the pale young guard, straight to the tall main doors of the hall. And he reached up and he threw the heavy bolt across them, locking the building not to keep me in, but to keep the ordinary closing world out. He turned back to the few of us standing there, and to the staff beginning to drift in from the side rooms at the sound of his voice. And he said the thing that I will hear in my head for the rest of my days. "Nobody leaves," he said. "The Admiral is home." The bolt, sliding home, made a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Warwick turned to the handful of staff who had come out onto the floor, a curator, 2 volunteers, a young woman with a ring of keys, and he told them, simply, who I was. He pointed at the wall. He pointed at me. And the hall, which had been about to close on another ordinary Tuesday, reorganized itself in front of my eyes around the truth. It is a strange thing to watch a room rearrange itself around the facts of your life after a lifetime of watching rooms rearrange themselves around the dismissal of it. People I had never met were looking at me the way you look at something you have read about and never expected to touch. The young woman with the keys had tears standing in her eyes. The curator was already talking quickly about wanting to record an oral history, and my brother stood at the edge of it all, holding the place where his certainty used to be. Then an older man in a volunteer's vest came across the floor. He moved slowly, the way men move when their knees have carried a lot of years, and he was looking at me with an intensity that made the others go quiet. He stopped a few feet away. He was perhaps 70, broad through the shoulders still, with a chief's bearing that age had bent but not erased. And he looked at my face, really looked, the way you look at someone you have seen before in the worst light there is. "I know you," he said. His voice shook. "I have known your face for 37 years. You're the officer who came back into the water for me." It was Otis Brennan, the young petty officer I had carried up out of the flooding after engine room of USS Garrick on a June night in 1989, was standing in front of me, 71 years old, a retired senior chief, a volunteer at the very hall that held the picture of the night I saved his life. I am not a woman who cries easily. The Navy trains it out of you, and my family trained it out of me earlier than that. But I felt my composure go, standing in that locked hall, looking at a man I had last seen as dead weight on my shoulder in the smoke, now alive and gray and weeping in a volunteer's vest. He took my hand in both of his. He told me he had volunteered at this hall for 11 years, specifically because of that wall, specifically because of that ship. He told me that he stood in front of that photograph and told the school children about the officer who went back down into the water for him, and that he had never once known her name or thought he would live to say it to her face. "I tell them about you every week," he said. I point at the picture and I say, "That's the officer who carried me out." I never thought I'd get to point at you and say, that's her, right there." Behind me, I heard a sound I had never heard before in 62 years. I heard my brother Lawrence begin to cry. He was standing at the edge of the group, watching a stranger weep with gratitude over the sister he had spent a lifetime making small, and something in him that had been frozen since we were children finally cracked. He had built his whole identity on the joke that I was nothing, and here was living proof, holding my hand and shaking, that I was the reason a man got to grow old. There is no joke that survives that. There's no nickname strong enough to stand against a 71-year-old chief weeping over the officer who gave him the rest of his life. Otis and I stood together for a long time, and he told me, in pieces, what the rest of his life had been. He had stayed in the Navy 26 more years after that night, made senior chief, raised 3 children, buried a wife he loved, and taken up volunteering at the hall when retirement got too quiet. He told me that for years he had assumed the officer in the photograph had died that night or sometime since, because no one had ever been able to tell him her name, and the not knowing had sat in him like a splinter. He had wanted, his whole life, to say thank you to a person and not just to a picture. And now, here I was, alive, in front of him, and he kept saying it, thank you, as though making up for 37 years of having no one to say it to. I told him he could stop thanking me. He said he did not think he ever would, and I understood that, because gratitude that old does not know how to be set down. I went to Otis Brennan, and I held the hand of the man I had carried out of the water, and for a moment the hall was very quiet around us, full of people who had stopped being strangers. The bell of USS Garrick gleamed on the wall above us, the bell of the ship that did not sink, and I understood, finally and completely, that the proof had never needed my family to make it real. It had been real all along. It had been hanging on a wall by the water, telling itself to 10,000 schoolchildren, kept alive by a man whose life I had saved. The whole time I had been driving home every year to beg for a verdict that was already mine. With the doors bolted and the truth standing in the open, the people in that hall began, without being asked, to give me the things my family had spent a lifetime withholding. Warwick walked me through the exhibit as its subject and not its visitor. He stood me in front of the framed citation, and instead of letting me read it to myself the way I always had, he read it aloud, his voice steady and formal, the way it was meant to be read. For her actions on that June night, at the risk of her own life, in conditions of extreme hazard. I had read those words 100 times alone. I had never once heard them said out loud in a room by a man who meant them. Fran arrived 20 minutes later. I had texted her from the floor, 3 words, "Come to the hall," and she had understood enough to get in her car. She came through the side door that the young woman with the keys unlocked for her, and she took in the scene, the bolted main doors, the gathered staff. Brennan still close to my elbow, my brother red-eyed and silent, and she did what Fran has always done. She came and stood next to me, the friend who had believed every word for 40 years, finally standing in the room where it was being proven, and she did not say "I told you so," because the best friends never have to. Brennan brought out a folder he kept behind the docent desk. It was thick, worn soft at the corners. Inside were letters from other Garrick sailors, men I had pulled or men who had simply walked off a ship that should have been their grave, and photographs of their children and their grandchildren. He had been collecting them for over a decade. A living chain of people who existed because of one night, curated quietly by a man who had not even known my name. He laid it in my hands and told me it was mine now, that it had always really been mine. It was Lawrence who finally crossed the floor to me. He came the way our family always came toward hard things, sideways, with his eyes down, reaching for the apology that costs nothing. He started to say that he guessed he had not realized that it was a long time ago, that nobody really knew. The old Donnelly move, the apology that spreads the blame around until it disappears. I stopped him, gently, but I stopped him. I had spent a lifetime accepting the cheap version of things from my family, and I was done. "Don't do that," I said. "Don't make it into something everyone missed. Say the true thing, Lawrence." He stood there for a long moment, and then, to his credit, the credit of a man finding the first honest words of his adult life, he said it. "I never once asked you what you actually did out there." His voice broke on it. "Not once. In 37 years I never asked." "No," I said. "You didn't. You can start now." I told him I was not interested in an apology that cost him nothing, that I did not need him to grovel, and I did not want a tearful scene that let him feel forgiven, and then go back to exactly who he had been. I told him that if he meant it, he could come back to this hall on a day it was open, and read the wall like a man learning his own family's history, and then we could talk. Trust was not something he could declare in a locked museum on the worst night for his pride. It was something he could earn, slowly, in the daylight, if he actually wanted to. He nodded, he did not argue, which was itself something new. And the two of us stood for a moment in front of the bell of USS Garrick, brother and sister, the joke that had run our whole lives, finally silent in the air between us. I had offered him a narrow bridge. Whether he would cross it was up to him. But for the first time I had built it on my terms, in a room that knew my name, with my hand resting on the rail of my own life, instead of reaching for someone else's door. Before we left that night, Warwick did one more thing that I will not forget. He asked the young guard, Trent, to come stand with us at the wall. The boy came nervously, still braced for punishment that was never going to arrive. And Warwick told him, in the gentle, instructive voice of a man who had spent a career making sailors out of kids, that the job he held was not standing at a door telling people to leave. The job was guarding the memory of what happened on that wall. He told Trent that one day an old man or an old woman would come in and stand a long time in front of one of these cases, and that when that happened, the right thing was not to clear them out. The right thing was to walk over quietly and ask if they had been there, if they were part of the story on the wall. Trent looked at me when he said it, and I watched something settle into the young man's face, the beginning of an understanding that the people in his care were not obstacles to his lockup, but the entire reason the building existed. I have thought since that I may have done more good for the Navy in that 1 minute than in some of my years of command. You never know which seed takes. The night at the hall did not stay in the hall. These things never do. A few days later, my brother did something genuinely out of character, something that told me the bridge might actually hold weight. He drove to our parents' house, and he told them what he had seen, not as a story against me, the way he had told stories my whole life. For once, he told it for me. I was not there for it, but my mother told me later, and Lawrence told me his part, and between them I can see it. Lawrence sitting at the same table where the nickname was born, telling our father that he had stood in a museum and watched a stranger weep over the sister we had all called the pretend admiral, telling him about the bell and the citation read aloud and the doors bolted and the words, "The admiral is home." My father did what my father has always done. He deflected. "A desk is a desk," he said. "They give out medals to everybody now." The old creed, reflexive, a man reaching for the only ruler he had ever trusted. And that might have been the end of it, the family closing back over the truth like water over a stone, except that my mother had finally had enough. Joan, 83 years old, got up from the table without a word and went to the closet, and she came back with the shoebox. 37 years of clippings, the notice of my reporting aboard Garrick, the citation, a grainy newspaper photo of a young officer at an awards ceremony, promotion announcements she had cut out in secret and hidden from the man she had married. She set the box down on the table in front of my father, and she opened it. "I have been saving our daughter's life in a box," she said, "because you would not let her keep it in this house." And she walked out of the room and left him sitting with 37 years of evidence he had refused to look at, finally spread out under his hands. I did not chase any of this. That is the part I am most quietly proud of. The old me would have been on the phone, managing it, hoping, applying again for the verdict. But something had changed in me when that bolt slid home. I had the hall. I had Brennan and his folder full of grandchildren. I had Fran and 19 families, and a wall that told my story to schoolchildren, whether or not my father ever stood up. For the first time in my life, the absence of his blessing was something I could survive without. I had spent my whole life trying to be admitted to a room. That night I realized I had built rooms of my own, full of people who already knew my name. Then Warwick called. The hall, he said, wanted to hold a small recognition event at the exhibit. An evening, the doors opened by choice this time, the citation read, the bell rung, a chance for the people whose lives touched that June night to gather in one place. They wanted me there, in uniform, in front of whoever I chose to invite. I sat with the invitation a long time. I looked at my phone, at my parents' number on the screen, and I thought about Fran's words, about driving back to a house to apply for a job I already had. I did not have to invite them. I had earned the right not to. The room would be full and warm whether or not they came. And that, it turned out, was exactly what made it possible to dial. I was not calling to ask for anything anymore. I was only offering them a door, the same kind of door I had offered Lawrence, open on my terms, in the daylight. What they did with it was up to them. I dialed. The recognition event was held on a warm evening a few weeks later, and this time the doors of the Naval Heritage Hall stood open by choice. I wore my service dress blue, the rear admiral stripes on my sleeve catching the light, and I stood by the bell of USS Garrick where I belonged. Otis Brennan stood beside me in his volunteer's vest, refusing the chair someone offered him, because, he said, a sailor stands his watch. Fran was in the front, of course, blunt and beaming. Warwick was at the lectern, and the hall, which I had only ever known empty on quiet Tuesday afternoons, was full. The room I had chosen was the room that mattered. Several of the men from that night had come, gray now, with their wives and their grown children and a scattering of grandchildren who fidgeted in the folding chairs. Warwick read the 19 names aloud, slowly, and after the last one, Otis Brennan reached up and rang the bell of USS Garrick once. A single clear note for the ship that did not sink and the men who walked off her. The sound of it went all the way through me. I had spent 37 years standing in front of that bell in silence. To hear it ring in a full and warm room, with the people it was rung for standing all around me, was a kind of completeness I had stopped believing I would ever feel. My father came. He came slowly with my mother on his arm, and he did not make a speech because my father has never made a speech in his life. He walked up to the photograph on the wall, the soot-streaked young officer carrying a man out of the water, and he stood in front of it for a long time, and then he did something I had never seen him do indoors. He took off his ball cap. He turned to me. He is 86 and his hands are not steady anymore, and he looked at me with an expression I had waited my whole life to see and had finally stopped waiting for, which is perhaps the only reason it was able to arrive. "I measured the whole Navy by how wet I got," he said. His voice was rough. 30 years, that was my whole ruler. I never once measured it by who went back down for the men in the water. He looked at the photograph and then at me. "You did. I was wrong about the part that counts. I'm sorry, Margaret." Behind him stood my brother Lawrence, who had come back to the hall twice on open days, as I had asked, and read the wall and learned his own family's history standing up. He did not say anything. He just met my eyes and nodded once, the nod of a man who had finally crossed the bridge, instead of just standing at the near end of it. I did not gloat. I want you to understand that, because it is the whole point. I had imagined, in my angrier years, a moment exactly like this one, and in those imaginings I had a speech ready, a lifetime of receipts to read back. But standing there in the warm hall with the bell still humming and Brennan's hand on my shoulder, I found I did not want any of it. I did not need my father to be small so that I could be large. I had stopped needing that the night the bolt slid home, so I let him stand in the truth beside me. I told him thank you, and I meant it. What surprised me most was how little the apology actually changed, and how much that was a relief rather than a disappointment. I had spent decades believing that those words from my father would be a kind of key, that they would unlock something in me that had been jammed shut since I was 9 with my hand on a cold hull. But the lock had already been opened, weeks earlier, by a stranger throwing a bolt across a museum door and saying the Admiral is home. My father's apology did not rescue me. It arrived to a woman who had already been rescued, and so it could be received as what it actually was, which was not my salvation, but his. He was the one who needed to say it, for his own sake, before the time to say it ran out. I was simply gracious enough finally to let him. There is a freedom in that I cannot fully describe. When you no longer need someone's words to survive, you can at last hear them as a gift instead of a verdict, and you can give the person the dignity of having offered something that mattered, even if it came 37 years late. The rest of the evening was small joys, and small joys are the whole reward. Fran making me laugh so hard I had to set down my coffee. Brennan introducing me to a sailor's granddaughter, a serious girl of about 10, who wanted to know if I had really gone into the water, and listening to him tell her yes, she did. She went back for your grandfather. My mother holding the shoebox in her lap, no longer hidden, finally in the light. The peace, the simple and enormous peace, of standing in a room that agreed with the facts of my life. The serious 10-year-old found me again near the end of the night while the folding chairs were being stacked, and she asked me whether she could be in the Navy when she grew up, and whether a girl could really take care of a ship. It was the same question I had asked my father at the same age, with my hand on a cold hull, and I felt the whole circle of my life close gently around that moment. I did not laugh the way he had laughed. I crouched down so we were eye to eye, and I told her that a girl could take care of a ship and a crew, and that one day if she worked hard enough, she could be the person everyone in the worst moment of their lives was counting on to be calm. I told her to find me when she was ready, and I would write her a letter to the academy myself. Her face did the thing my own chest used to do when my father said the word Navy. It stood up straight. And I thought, that is the verdict that matters, not the one handed down to me, the one I get to hand forward. I have thought a lot about why it took a stranger waving me toward a door to finally change everything. I think it is because for 37 years, I kept asking the wrong room for permission. I kept driving back to the house where the verdict lived, when the proof had been hanging on a wall by the water the whole time, telling itself to school children, kept alive by a man whose life I saved. So here is what I want to say to you, whoever you are, however you got here. There is a room somewhere that already knows what you are worth. It might be full of people, or it might be one wall in a quiet building, or it might just be the honest accounting you keep inside yourself. Stop waiting for permission from the people who never once looked. Stop applying for a job you have already held with honor. Walk in, stand at the wall, ring the bell. You earned it. Now go let yourself be home. If you've ever stood in a room full of people who refused to see what you had done and kept showing up anyway, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Was there a moment when the truth finally spoke for itself? Did the people who doubted you ever come around, or did you have to learn to be enough on your own? Tell me. I read every story. And if this one reached something in you, hit subscribe and sit with me a while. There is always room at the wall.